Hello, everyone, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we've been exploring history, religion, and culture and why they matter. And of course, Mount Olympus being the place where the Greek gods lived and from which they would dispense their Olympian judgments, as an assessment being utterly dispassionate, impartial, and delivered far above the mad squabbling of us mere mortals, which is, of course, what we're aspiring to, but, the fog. The fog. And my name is Coel Campo.
And my name is Mike Pierce, and today we're doing the second episode in our new series on the early church. We're going to be doing two series on the early church. This is the first one. The second one will be later this year. And this episode is called Christians to the Lion. That's a quotation from Tertullian, as we'll see in a bit. Roman persecution, causes and effects. So we're going to be starting off by considering, well, why did the Romans persecute Christians?
Yeah, the Romans worshipped, obviously, the Roman gods, and they were mostly just Roman versions of the Greek gods. So were the Romans religiously intolerant of all other religions?
No, actually, they weren't. By the standards of most societies, they were fairly religiously tolerant. You could practice whatever religion you liked with caveats. The first caveat was that alongside whatever religion you wanted to practice, you did have to sacrifice to the Roman gods occasionally as a kind of loyalty test. So everyone was subject to that. And the second requirement was that your religion, whatever it was, should not be subversive of the Roman Empire or really just of social order more generally. Now the Jews had an exemption from having to sacrifice to the Roman gods.
And why were the Jews exempted? I mean, I thought the Romans didn't really like the Jews.
They didn't much like them. They found the Jews very irritating because the Jews kind of stuck out like a sore thumb. They were so insistent upon their own religious observations. And although it didn't matter so much in Palestine, they tended not to mingle very much with non-Jews, with Gentiles, when they were in diaspora. And in Palestine, of course, there were constantly these there was this constant churn of incipient revolution just underneath the surface. You've only got to read the Gospels and you can see that that's what's going on. So they were pretty ticked off at them, but they exempted the Jews on pragmatic grounds because the Jews would not sacrifice to any gods but their own, Yahweh. And if you tried to force them on the point, they would fight. You'd probably have to kill them all. And as the Romans already anticipated this, and they were correct in this anticipation, if you had to fight them, they fought rather well. So it was easier just to do what the Romans always did with the Jews, which is to growl, snarl, and grumpily give them an exemption. Well, by about the 50s of the first century, the Roman authorities had finally realized that the Christians were not covered by this exemption, that they weren't simply another sect of Judaism. At first, that's what people thought they were. Heck, that's what the Christians thought they were. But that's not the direction things took. And by about the mid-50s, it was becoming clear to the Roman official eye that this was a whole different kind of thing. In fact, a new faith, and therefore they didn't come under the exemption, and therefore they were required to sacrifice to the Roman gods. But like the Jews, they wouldn't. Unlike the Jews, they wouldn't fight back, and so persecution was doable. There was also a general belief that abandonment of worshipping the Roman gods would lose the empire the favour of the Roman gods. The Roman gods favoured Rome, but you had to stay on the right side of them. So if too many people wouldn't give them honour, maybe they wouldn't favour Rome. Now, I don't want to stress this point too strongly because it's not entirely clear that all Romans actually even believed in these gods. They kind of semi-believed in them. But nevertheless, if you did believe in them, there was this idea. The fourth point is rapid Christian proselytism. Now, Christians weren't unique in proselytizing for their faith. The Jews did it, actually, in this period. But they were unique in the speed at which this was all happening. And they were sucking in loads of people who hadn't been Jews, who they were bringing in loads of Gentiles after the first decade or two. And they were bringing in people, especially among the lower orders, which again is going to alarm people in authority what's going on, particularly in view of the fact that, and this is something we dealt with in the last episode, Who Became a Christian, that some Christian ideas and practices were considered subversive of social order. People becoming Christians on an individual basis, and so undermining family solidarity. Christians emphasizing the idea that everybody's created in the image of God. Jews believe that too, of course, but Christians stressed it far more. And that was very empowering. It gave kind of agency, to use our current jargon, to people who didn't have a lot of social power. And that, again, the authorities found unnerving. But they were perhaps encouraged to do this because Christians were actually kind of unpopular, as we'll see in a minute, among the general population. And that sort of gives social support for the authorities to persecute.
Yeah, and some of this stuff we talked about in the last episode. So if you're interested in more on that, you should check it out.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, please do look at back episodes generally, folks. We really encourage you to do that. Right.
It helps, if you've watched all of them.
Because sometimes I'll say something that may confuse people, and we're kind of presupposing something that isn't necessarily clear. So sometimes it can be good to look back. Yes, that's right. The first so the Roman official perception shifts sometime, we think, around the mid 50s, and it takes nearly another decade before the dam breaks and Romans start to persecute Christians. And the breaking point comes in 64 AD with Nero. Now, he was emperor from 54 to 68. He was quite popular among the poor, but Roman historians agree in condemning him as a vain, compulsive, debauched showman. Actually, it's a good job we don't have any politicians at all who answer those descriptions these days, isn't it?
Yeah, that would be terrible,
Yeah,
wouldn't
it
it?
would be terrible, right? But moving swiftly on.
Yeah, so Nero is rumored to have started the Great Fire of Rome because he wanted to rebuild it on a grand scale. Is that right?
Right. Well, it's certainly right that he's rumored to have done it. It's not provable. It wasn't provable then, and nearly 2,000 years later, it's certainly not provable. But the suspicion was there. And Tacitus, a Roman historian writing about 2 generations later, describes what happened then. He says that all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief, this is amongst the population of Rome, that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class of people hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace.
A class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. So it wasn't just the authorities who disliked Christians. This was a pretty popular hatred.
Yes, it was. And Christians could be criticized by ordinary people for the same kinds of reasons that Jews were criticized. They were kind of standoffish. They were moral, so they wouldn't take part in lots of the immoralities of social life. They wouldn't go to the extremely cruel entertainments, public executions, gladiator fights, and so on. So they were considered standoffish. But where people could excuse Jews from this, even though they didn't much like it, because they could tell themselves, well, this is part of their ancestral customs, so, what can you do? There was the feeling that Christians didn't have that let off in popular opinion because they'd actually chosen to do this. Right? They hadn't come from this kind of
Right.
background. This was something they'd decided to do. So who do they think they are? Do they think they're better than the rest of us? This was the direction of thought generally. Well, Tacitus continues. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their centre and become popular. Now, this sentence always makes me laugh. Right, okay, so it was checked for the moment. Well, actually, just a couple of days. And we happen to be recording this on Easter Day, people. So, yeah, the thought of the resurrection is at the forefront of our minds. Checked just for a moment, but then breaks out again. So he quickly skips over that. But then we have the same kind of attitude that we found in the previous episode with Celsus, this superior upper class Roman looking down on people. Now, Romans were mostly not racists, not that the concept quite existed then, but even applying that concept to them, they're mostly not. But they certainly did look down on other cultures, as the Greeks did, as somehow barbaric. And you could look down on non-wealthy immigrants to Rome. And Rome is the biggest city for pretty much thousands of miles, literally in any direction. So loads of people came there from all across the empire, and they generally came in, as immigrants tend to do, right at the bottom of society, um, where they were looked down on. And they brought with them their cultures and often their religions. And it's all of that that is reflected in the way that Tacitus is talking here. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, so no one really believed that the Christians had done this, although Nero is kind of saying that they did, as of hatred against mankind. Hatred of mankind. Well, that's the idea that these people are standing aside from the rest of us. They're not mingling in with immoral behaviors and cruel entertainments and so on.
Despite the fact that Christians had you know, a better view of, or a more sacred view of human life, even still that didn't really translate necessarily to the people around them.
That would be a plus side that if you're amongst the poor, and let's view this with Tacitus's mindset for a moment, the rabble, right? On the one hand, you might kind of like the fact that the Christians don't despise you, but then most of them are simply people from among you anyway. But set against that is these people disapprove of popular immoral behavior. I mean, this is the kind of
Right.
social experience that many, many Christians have had ever since, including in the present in many contexts.
Right, that's sort of what I was thinking, is that you kind of catch it from both sides, you
Yes,
know?
yes, yes. Okay, so Tacitus continues. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or drove about in a chariot. He seems to have been a bit of a nutcase who did this kind of thing, but it's also unspeakably cruel. So his weird party is being lit by living torches, who are Christians who've been smeared with tar and perhaps nailed to crosses or posts, and they are the light. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, and Tacitus certainly thinks that they did, there arose a feeling of compassion. For it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed. Now, this is the first real outbreak of Roman persecution against the Christians. And in it, Peter and Paul are amongst those early martyrs.
Now, Peter and Paul are generally believed to have been martyred in Rome, with Peter being crucified upside down and Paul being beheaded, just like in the picture that we have. So, do we have any documentary evidence for this?
Strictly speaking, no, we don't. But this is one of those occasions where oral tradition is so unanimous and goes back so early that it is generally considered by most historians to be kind of stupid to discount it or disregard it. Right? A lot of oral traditions are very unreliable, particularly if there's some kind of gap between the events that are quotes remembered unquote, right? And the first people we see recounting it, or if there are contradictions or something like that. But that's not the case here, and we think we're on pretty solid ground in thinking that this is really the case. So yeah, this picture shows Peter crucified upside down. He's supposed to have said that he wasn't worthy to die in the same way as Jesus, and so as a form of mockery, they crucified him upside down. Paul gets better treatment to the last, but remember that he is a Roman citizen, so he has a whole load of rights that other people don't have, and he is merely beheaded. Some sources refer to Peter and Paul as having been martyred, quote, on the same occasion. But it seems likely that Peter was killed in October 64, that is 3 months after the fire of Rome that triggered the persecution, and Paul in 67. Now, remember, Paul had already spent some time in prison, and we know that simply from the accounts in the New Testament. It's not clear how long Peter had been in Rome. Now, this is a disputed question, and we're not going to go into that now. So people can put all their rude comments on YouTube or message them to us or something like that. We're just going to leave that one sit there for now, but we'll say simply that it's very unclear how long Peter had been in Rome. But Paul had certainly been there for a while. All right, well, it's one extremely ferocious outburst, but it's just confined to the city of Rome. But it sets up a situation in which there is sporadic persecution for the next 2.5 centuries. Let's move to another Roman and unsympathetic source now, a couple of generations later, and that's a letter from Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger, because his uncle, Pliny the Elder, had been a Roman writer and historian who died in 79 AD at the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So this is his nephew, who late in his life, for the last 3 years, is a governor of a distant province of Bithynia and Pontus. And while he was fulfilling this function, he wrote a load of letters back to Rome just to kind of cover his rear end, to make sure he was doing the right thing. And we've got, I think it's 267 of his letters. This is perhaps the most famous one because it deals with how he's supposed to proceed when prosecuting Christians. This is the course I've taken with those who are accused before me as Christians. I ask them whether they were Christians, and if they confessed, I ask them a second and third time with threats of punishment. And if they kept to it, I ordered them for execution. For I held no question that whatever it was that they admitted in any case, obstinacy and unbending perversity deserved to be punished. There it is again. That's the very attitude that Romans had held towards the Jews. right? Boredom and irritation. I don't care, and these people are being annoying. And that's exactly what's coming out there. There were others of the like insanity, but as these were Roman citizens, I noted them down to be sent to Rome. So there's the preferential treatment again.
Yeah, so the Roman citizens are still getting special treatment just like Paul had.
Yes, yes, they are. So they're not executed there and then. They're sent to Rome, and the authorities there, under Emperor Trajan, they can sort them out. Well, we can see here the map that highlights the area of Bithynia and Pontus, where Pliny is governor from 110 to his death in around 113. So it's what we would now call, well, Pontus is like the northern part of what's now Turkey. Obviously, it wasn't Turkey then, what they would call Asia, perhaps still call Asia Minor. And Bithynia, more the sort of northwest part. So he's governor of those two regions. Okay, as for those who said that they neither were nor ever had been Christians, I thought it right to let them go, since they recited a prayer to the gods at my dictation, made supplication with incense and wine to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought into court for the purpose, together with images of the gods, and moreover cursed Christ, things which, so it said, those who are really Christians cannot be made to do. So it said. So he's not really very familiar with this. Others who were named by the informer said that they were Christians and then denied it, explaining that they had been but had ceased to be such, some 3 years ago, some a good many years, a few even 20. All these two worshipped your statue and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. The contagion of that superstition has penetrated not only the cities, but also the villages and country. Now, again, I want to refer back to what we dealt with in the last episode, that it's the towns and the cities that are the first foci of evangelization. And generally, certainly what people like Paul did was to plant churches there from converts and then move on to another place and leave them to evangelize their own backyard out in the villages and country. And that seems to have been a general pattern through the early centuries. Yet it seems possible to stop it and set it right. At any rate, it's certain enough that the almost deserted temples begin to be frequented. Well, now that language suggests that the evangelization had gone very far indeed, that a huge slice of the population in this region, at least, had become Christian. The ceremonies of religion, he means the Roman religion, long disused, are restored. From this, it may easily be supposed what a multitude of men can be reclaimed if there be a place of repentance. And Trajan's reply, the emperor, is this: they are not to be sought out, but if they are accused and convicted, they must be punished. Yet on this condition, that whoso denies himself to be a Christian and makes the fact plain by his action, that is, by worshipping our gods, shall obtain pardon on his repentance, however suspicious his past conduct.
So Trajan is the emperor that comes after Nero, is that right?
This is 2 generations later. We're now
Later.
Nero died in 68. We're now somewhere in that window of 110 to 113. So no, this is several up the line.
He doesn't seem particularly concerned with trying to get as many victims as possible.
No, that's exactly right. He's not. And in a sense, this is a truism for most regimes, whether concerning religion or in our own day, political creeds. Sometimes some regimes really are bloodthirsty and they're trying to see how many people they can kill. But that's rare. And even when it does happen, it kind of burns itself out within a few years. Most of the time, most regimes are simply looking for outward conformity. And that's what Trajan's trying to do here. This is because the creed itself is simply a form of social control. And if people will let themselves be controlled, we're not really concerned with what people really believe in the depths of their innermost souls. It's a bit like in late 16th century England. So long time after this, where some of the zealous Protestants in Elizabeth's government really wanted to bust a gut, so to speak, in going after people who they feared were secretly Catholic. And Elizabeth's response was, "We will not make windows into men's souls." Now, she did not at all believe in religious toleration, not of Catholicism or anything else except the Church of England. But what she didn't want was going chasing for people who were at least conforming outwardly. And that's exactly what Trajan's after here. Well, our next story, I'm afraid, is really rather horrible. So those of you with a sensitive disposition might want to scroll ahead 6 or 7 minutes. And this deals with some martyrdoms about 90 years later, Perpetua and Felicitas, who were martyred in 203. And they are from, or at least, they're put to death in Carthage. They're from that area. And our map shows us the relative positions of those. So in North Africa. And what I've got here, we do have the original document telling us this story, but it's rather briefer and clearer to borrow the account, a sort of a synopsis of it from a current, very recent historian, actually, Elaine Pagels. So I've simply plundered this from her recent 25 years old book, something like that. So she says, a widely popular true story of the time, 203, tells of a mistress and her personal slave who were convicted as Christians after they refused to revere the emperor's image.
So, as we noticed last time, Christians did have slaves. And in this case, the slave was a Christian too.
Right, right. And again, I think we're going to have to refer people back to the previous episode where we looked at all of the arguments that go on around that subject today and how, in general, I maintain that both sides of this argument are actually misinformed, partly about the nature of ancient society and partly about the nature of what Christianity is set up to be. So I'm not going to repeat that now, but for those for whom that is like an issue in their minds, please refer to our previous episode. And I think it's one of the last things we deal with, sometime in the last 5 or 10 minutes anyway. So together, they were thrown to wild animals and slaughtered in the public amphitheatre in Carthage in a spectacle celebrating the emperor's birthday. The aristocratic protagonist, Vibia Perpetua, fluent in both Greek and Latin, wrote about her experiences from the time of her arrest until the evening of her execution. Perpetua, 22 years old, recently married, nursing her infant son, was arrested along with her friends Saturus and Saturninus and her personal slave Felicitas and the slave Revocatus. All of them would end up being killed. Perpetua and her companions were scourged and thrown into a stifling and crowded African jail. And after her arrest, Perpetua's father, out of love for me, she wrote, was trying to persuade me to change my decision. Well, we have more of what her father had to say, but I've cut that out of this version here. Perpetua's slave, Felicitas, was pregnant when she was arrested and was in her 8th month as the execution date approached. Felicitas was very distressed that her martyrdom would be postponed because of her pregnancy, for it's against the law for pregnant women to be executed. And she feared that she'd have to survive her Christian companions and alone endure a later execution along with criminals. 2 days before the execution, the Christians prayed for her, and immediately after their prayer, the labour pains came upon her. She suffered a good deal in her labour because of the natural difficulty of an 8-month delivery. One of the Christian women took the infant daughter to raise as her own, leaving Felicitas free to join her companions. As Perpetua had hoped, a fellow Christian continued the story. She had refused to allow herself or her companions to be sent out into the arena in priestly robes of the Roman deities, obviously, because the whole reason they were being put to death was because they refused to recognize those deities. But just as Perpetua and Felicitas were to enter the arena, they were forcibly stripped naked and placed in nets, so that even the crowd was horrified when they saw that one was a delicate young girl and the other woman fresh from childbirth, with milk still dripping from her breasts. And so they were brought back again and dressed in loose tunics. So one gathers from this that they go out into the arena, and suddenly the crowd starts booing or drawing breath or crying shame or something like that. So they're brought back in, dressed in loose tunics, and then sent out. And a mad heifer was set loose after them. Perpetua was gored and thrown to the ground. She got up, and seeing Felicitas crushed and fallen, went over to her and lifted her up, and the two stood side by side. Then, after undergoing further ordeals and seeing Saturus endure agonizing torture, Perpetua and Felicitas, along with the others, were called to the centre of the arena to be slaughtered. A witness records that Perpetua screamed as she was struck on the bone, and then she took the trembling hand of the gladiator and guided it to her throat. Sorry
Well,
about that.
this is a pretty horrible story. Yeah.
It is a really horrible story. Now, it has to be said that lots of Christian accounts of martyrdom are pretty gruesome, and there's reason to think that some of them are embellished, perhaps or probably not this one, actually. A lot of the others that are embellished include all kinds of miracle stories, most of which are actually bizarre and bear little relationship to the kind of thing that we see, for example, in the Gospels or even in the book of Acts. So, but yeah, this is a truly horrible story, and in all or certainly almost all of its details, almost certainly correct. Now, it's around this time that Tertullian, who's also from the same area, comments scathingly on the persecution of Christians.
And Tertullian is one of the most important of the church fathers, is that right?
Yes, he is. Very substantial. We've got a lot of his writings. He's important for several reasons. He's important because he's the first person, and we'll consider this in a later episode, to use the term Trinity to describe Christian experiences of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And he's also the first church father to write in Latin. Up until this time, all of them had written in Greek, and even after this time, many of them still did. But he's the first significant figure to write in Latin. He's also important for a slightly more fun reason, in that he writes so scathingly all the time. It's not just the passage we're going to look at here. In fact, back in the 18th and 19th century in universities, when such people, because classics were read generally in the original languages, many students who weren't at all religious enjoyed reading Tertullian simply because of his biting wit. And we see a flavour of that here. So they think the Christians the cause of every public disaster, of every affliction with which the people are visited. If the Tiber, the river in Rome, rises as high as the city walls, if the Nile does not send its water up over the fields, if the heavens give no rain, if there's an earthquake, if there's famine or pestilence, straightway the cry is, away with the Christians to the lion. What? Shall you give such multitudes to a single beast? Pray tell me how many calamities befell the world and particular cities before Tiberius reigned, before the coming, that is, of Christ. In other words, such natural disasters have always happened, and who are you going to blame then? The point being that people blamed the Christians for this, because the Roman gods were turning away their favour from Rome, because there were so many of these Christians who would not honour the Roman gods. And so that was angering the gods, and hence the calamities. And so the calamities were held to be the Christians' fault. I mean, it's strange that this kind of behaviour, however irrational it is, seems almost universal in human societies. We noticed when we did our first series on the Jews and Jewish history, how many people in the Middle Ages blamed calamities like, for example, the Black Death, on the Jews. And
Right.
in our own time, even when people aren't necessarily looking for divine or miraculous causation for disasters. There's all kinds of people who want to turn around and say blame immigrants for this, that, or the other disaster, right? So it's a kind of a universal human and irrational, but tragic. Yeah. But in this period, it's turned on the Christians.
Yeah, I think some people call this like the scapegoat theory.
Yes,
Have you
yeah,
heard of that?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, people looking for a scapegoat.
Well, all I can say is his sarcasm reminds me of
Don't
somebody
even
else that I've read.
don't even go there.
It had to be said.
it, there was a kind of inevitability about it, I suppose. Yes. All right. Well, now we can't complete this episode without noticing, I'm afraid, that in recent years, some people have been arguing that the persecution of Christians mostly didn't happen, and I would want to contend that these arguments are, in fact, nonsense and are driven almost entirely by modern politics. That modern societies now are not simply secular, which is fine, but secularist, which is not. And that as part and parcel of that, there's a desire to find Christians as having been guilty for all kinds of ills through history, and that they can't possibly claim any kind of victimhood, even historically, and that these accounts are all written by Christians themselves and are therefore untrue, which is an illogical step in itself. This kind of stuff. To be clear, and as we've tried to show here, non-Christian and Christian writers of the period agree that persecution happened. And all historians until very recently have accepted their essential veracity. Now, it's certainly true that many, maybe most, miraculous accounts of individual martyrdoms are certainly greatly embellished. Right, so we get, well, the account that we saw with Perpetua and Felicitas, but imagine something far worse or more drawn out or convoluted, very often convoluted, and with all kinds of bizarre miracles attached. That kind of thing. Well, yeah, okay, a lot of that can be discounted, although in most cases, not the martyrdom itself. Um, Christian accounts of persecution are contemporaneous with the events themselves, as we just saw with Tertullian. So to have falsified the truth would have invited ridicule and also loss of faith among existing Christians. You know, if I'm an ordinary Christian and then these stories are circulating and I know them to be untrue, well, that's probably going to persuade me to stop being a Christian. The argument that these things didn't happen is absurd on several levels. But also, we need to notice that there are several developments in Christian doctrine and several breakaways from the church, which we'll notice in a moment, which were driven precisely by the reality of persecution. It was the persecution that made those things happen. And we'll have a look very briefly in a moment at what those exactly were. So I'd want to contend that these recent arguments are actually overreach and nonsense.
And I was curious too if you have anything to say to the people, I've probably throughout my entire time in church, I've heard people say things going back to, these sort of martyrs, and they'll say things like, well, all of us as Christians should be prepared to undergo this kind of persecution, to be beaten and crucified
Right?
and I don't know, it feels almost kind of strange to me that they're like glorifying this sort of martyrdom and saying you need to be able to be a martyr too, and that just never really sat very well with me, and so I was wondering if you could have anything to say about that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to disappoint you by saying I, I actually agree with that. But where does this sensibility come from? Well, from this experience, and it becomes quite deeply entrenched in Christian teaching itself, which we'll notice in a minute. I mean, we are at the opposite. Our typical experience is at the opposite extreme from these people, right? And So they're kind of inhabiting a world that for us is strange. And it's not that there's been persecution in all societies all the way through 2000 years, but it has been surprisingly and distressingly frequent. And we're living, at the end of, hopefully not the end of, but at any rate, after a kind of a couple of centuries lacuna or in that experience. And so it all seems really rather distant to us. But there are still parts of the world where Christianity is easily, by far and away, the most persecuted religion in the world today. Right? There's no
Right.
getting away from that. So it certainly is a very frequent experience, and it's been there from the beginning. And it's likely to be so because of the nature of Christianity itself. But maybe that's something we can look at more on another occasion, I think.
To be continued.
Yeah, to be continued for sure. And maybe if people want to make comments about that, and please, message us, write rude comments or even nice comments in the on YouTube or what have you. Um, we will start. Just a quick message to our viewers: we will start to engage a little more with some of those comments. A number have sought to plunge us precisely into current political arguments, and so we have refrained from replying to those one way or the other for the same reason that we're not really engaging with those in these episodes here. But that's something that we certainly would engage with. All right. Well, when did persecution happen? First, I want to say that the persecution through these 2.5 centuries is episodic and continual rather than continuous, right? So it keeps coming back. It's not 250 years of constant grind of persecution everywhere. It was possible to be a Christian in this period and spend your whole life, maybe even a long life, without having experienced this. But you always knew that it could happen. So the first one is under Nero, and it's completely vicious and horrible, but it's confined to the city of Rome. The Decian persecution, so called because it happens under the Emperor Decius of 250, was empire-wide. Decius was emperor for just 2 years, from 249 to 251. But he sent out an order across the empire that everybody had to give sacrifice to the Roman gods, and this was a way of flushing out the Christians. And there was some pretty savage persecution on account of it. And there was a similar one under Diocletian from 303 onwards, also empire-wide, and easily the biggest and worst. In fact, it's often simply called the Great Persecution, capital GP. Produced a very large number of martyrs, especially among church leaders, many of whom would be revered thereafter as patron saints of their cities. But there were lots of others that were local or regional, but often horrifying. So there was one, for example, and I'm just giving some examples here because there are so many, in Lugdunum in southern Gaul, what we would call today Lyon in France, in 177, which killed very many of the church and pretty much all of its leaders, except Irenaeus, who was away on church business at the time. So when he got back, he was the leader because he was the only one still alive. And he went on to produce an awful lot of very influential writing. He's one of the most important church fathers. There was one in Alexandria in 202, which killed Origen's father, Origen, another church father, Leonides. We have the story, we're not really sure whether this is true, that Origen, who was a teenager at the time, wanted to go out and be put to death alongside his father, and his mother saved him by hiding his clothes. So although he was prepared to be killed, he wasn't prepared to go out naked into the street. And so he survived to become an influential theologian. And another one in Carthage in 203, that's the one that killed Perpetua and Felicitas, among a number of others. Well, let's consider this Emperor Diocletian. He is from a place called Salona in Roman Dalmatia, and we can see on the map where that is. This map shows the arrangement of the provinces in the 3rd to the 5th centuries. So quite a few Roman emperors came from what we now call the Balkans, and Diocletian is one of them. He was rather unusual in that he retired from office rather than dying in office or being killed in office, and went back there, as we'll see in a moment. Well, this picture here shows the remains of the amphitheatre in the Roman city of Salona, where a whole load of Christians were martyred under his reign as emperor. And the tombs of a number of them are just a few yards away from this.
And this is in Salona. You and I have been there. This is the Roman ruins outside the city of Split, right? And it was abandoned in the 6th century because it couldn't properly be defended against invading Goths.
That's right. Yes, yes. It wasn't a case of barbarians bursting in, shrieking and killing everybody. They just threatened to burst in and shriek and kill everybody. And so people ran away. And they went in several directions, but a lot of them went just a couple of miles down to the coast, where Diocletian had built himself a palace more than 200 years before as a kind of retirement home. And since then,
Oh,
it had been abandoned. It was already a couple of hundred years old, but it had high walls and was far more defensible than the city. And we can see an artist's impression of it here, what it would have looked like.
that little tower in the middle of the palace, that's where Diocletian's pagan temple would have been.
Right, yeah, that's it. I'm delighted to tell you, well, I don't need to tell you, you already know, but to remind you and to tell our listeners that that temple is now and has been for hundreds and hundreds of years the cathedral in the centre of Split, because Salonae Palatium, Salona Palace, Diocletian's palace there, became the centre of the medieval, well, it became the medieval city of Split. And even today, at least two of the walls of that palace, maybe it's three, no, two, I think, still no, three, still stand. And for hundreds of years, the city was simply in what had been Diocletian's palace. So when you go there today, well, let's have a look at this picture here. That's now and that's then, and you can see where the little tower was, and there's a taller tower now. That's the steeple of the cathedral. But that was the city of Split through the Middle Ages, and even today, you go in there and it's just swarming with people. There's shops and discotheques and apartments and the cathedral and goodness knows what all else there. It's in fact it's way busier now than it was in Diocletian's time or for a century or two after. Yeah. Okay, so what about the effects of persecution? Well, it helped hastening the development of doctrine, as Christians understandably wanted to know what was or was not worth dying for. What concessions can we make to the persecutors? What can we give up, and where do we simply have to stand firm and die? It also helped hasten the emergence of a church hierarchy who can make authoritative decisions about what to do or not do in an emergency and so on. I mean, this was happening anyway, but this church hierarchy was building up. We'll have a look at that in a later episode. But this kind of hurries the process along. But it also fostered serious arguments about how to treat people who had buckled under pressure once the latest emergency had subsided. People who had gone and done what was required of them and basically apostatized and then come back after the persecution is over and say, look, we're really sorry, we didn't mean this. We do believe all this in our hearts. We want to be readmitted into the church. What are you going to do with them? Well, there were schisms over this stuff. There were rigorist responses. People who followed a chap called Novatian after the persecution under Decius in 250. And the process is repeated with rigorists following a chap called Donatus after the great persecution under Diocletian. Both of those, by the way, happen in Roman North Africa. And then you get the larger body of the church that want to say, no, we should readmit these people under conditions, and the bishops get to decide. That's part of the process of the emergence of a church hierarchy. and the idea of the sort of institutional authority of the church. So that's starting to develop. It'll develop a whole lot faster in the 4th and 5th centuries, as we'll see later this year.
So yeah, it seems like persecution doesn't always make Christians more holy. It can bring out their quarrelsome or legalistic instincts.
Yes, and not just in the early church, that's happened in much more recent times as well. So the bust ups among, for example, Baptists under communism in the Soviet Union, or Catholics under communism in China in much more recent times. Yes, it can make people behave badly or truculently. Although I suppose, you can kind of understand it if you're someone who's been prepared to sacrifice everything, or maybe some of your loved ones have actually been killed or suffered horribly under persecution, and then you see other people who've buckled or made all kinds of compromises you think inadmissible, just carrying on as before. That can make you kind of mad and start to get a bit legalistic. So this, we've got to be totally realistic here. This is the kind of thing that happens.
Right,
But
right,
the persecution also sets in motion what would later become the cult of the saints. These people who are martyrs, from our church, and now they're in heaven with Jesus, and we have some sense that they are with us still. They're part of us, and you can see where that line of thought, which is got to be good in itself, but where it can kind of lead to in the longer run. And an ideal of, this is coming back to the point you made earlier on, and a theology about martyrdom, which can sometimes be a little perverse, as if martyrdom is almost something to be courted. That started very early.
right.
We haven't had time to include here one of the earlier martyrs, Ignatius of Antioch. We will probably have a look at him actually a little bit in another episode. But he was one of these people who is entirely admirable and also somewhat repulsive. A grumpy old man, and I know what I'm talking about when I identify someone as a grumpy old man. Believe me, say nothing. His Kenneth Post, say nothing.
Yeah,
Right, um,
no comment.
right. But he had practically idealized martyrdom as a good for its own sake, almost to be sought out. And this whole experience creates that kind of an ethos, which is not necessarily that helpful in the longer run.
Right.
Okay, well, we're done with that, and next week we're going to be looking at the phenomenon of heresy and what we mean by heresy in these early centuries, and what the consequences of that have been for the development of Christianity in the longer run. But as I know we've said this before, please do if you like this episode, repost it to your social media, recommend it to friends. We would really, really value that. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, please do that. And we look forward to seeing you next time and on many future occasions.
That's right. Thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you very much. Okay, goodbye now.